So let's try this again. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Our lecture on Russia in the Americas, or Seward's Folly, as I'm also calling this. And if you've never heard that expression, don't know what it means, you will know by the time the lecture is over. We have only one more lecture after this one, and this afternoon we'll talk about the Klondike Gold Rush. We'll talk about the Klondike Gold Rush, which technically was in Canada, although it greatly affected Alaska and the Americas. San Francisco and Seattle were very much involved in it. But then later on, there was also a gold rush near Nome in Alaska, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. But the Klondike was the biggest one, and so that'll be a focus of it. But in order to get there, most of the people had to go through Alaska, so we'll get into that. Starting in 1741, so we're talking about before the American Revolution, the Russians began to explore the area of the Aleutian Islands, and then from the Aleutian Islands they traveled up an island at a time until they got to the Alaska Peninsula and then Alaska itself. A name that might sound familiar to you, Vitus Bering, whose name was lent to the Bering Straits and to the Bering Sea. He was actually Danish born, but he was in service to the Russians. He and a Russian sailor named Alexei Kirikov, the two of them were sent out on a mission once to explore this area in 1741. Aboard two ships called the St. Peter and the St. Paul, good names, and they discovered the eastern islands of the Aleutians. Kirikov discovered some of those. The western islands of the Aleutians were discovered by Vitus Bering. Kirikov was able to sail back to Kamchatka Peninsula in Russia and to take back samples of some of the fur pelts, very high quality fur pelts that got everybody excited. Bering was not so fortunate. He and his crew shipwrecked on an island, which later became known as Bering Island. It was part of the Komodorsky, or the Commander Islands, as they're known in English. And he ended up getting ill there and dying on this, what was later called Bering Island. And they were shipwrecked. Their ship was beaten up by a storm. And after Bering died, his crew was able to lash together pieces of the boat and actually make it back to Kamchatka. So they returned there. But everybody got very excited about the quality of the furs and the reports that they received from Chirikov and Bering's crews about what the potential would be along the Aleutian Islands. Almost immediately, Russian traders, trappers, particularly and hunters, began to invade the Commander Islands, and then from there, as I say, they sort of worked their way up the Aleutian Islands and began to settle there. So the Russians had a foothold in North America, at least the northwestern part of North America, long before any other European powers were there. Initially, the Russians, when they came in, for the most part, they had a pretty decent relationship with the various Native American tribes that existed there, the Aleuts, the Tlingits, and others. Most places it was quite stable, there was good cooperation, and almost immediately they started to have intermarriage between Russians, especially Russian men, and Aleut and Tlingit women. And they started having children, and there was wide acceptance for the children of these Russian Aleut marriages. They, in fact, on a fairly short order, most of the enterprises that the Russians started ended up, within one generation or so, being run by, for the most part, native Alaskans. Now that's in some areas. The Russians tended to adopt, contrary to almost every other sort of Western settlement in the world, the Russians tended to adopt the Aleut's way of life in many ways, partly because they were much better adapted to life in this very extreme climate. They began to dress like the Aleuts. They used their boats, their hunting styles, that sort of thing, rather than coming in and trying to force their ways onto the native peoples that lived there. The Russians in many areas began to develop public education. They worked to transliterate. The Aleuts did not at that point have a written language, and so using the Cyrillic alphabet, the Russians began to create transliterated documents in an Aleut language they could learn. They also started teaching Russian. They were very involved in even extending Russian citizenship to many of the people in the Aleutian Islands. And so this, for the most part, I'm going to talk about some exceptions of this in a minute. For the most part, this was a pretty positive relationship in most areas. In fact, in 1763, Catherine the Great became the Empress of Russia, and she offered her blessing to the Aleut Native Americans and encouraged a friendly relationship with them and that they be respected. So they really did develop a culture that was an interesting blend in many areas. In 1793, the Russian Orthodox Church began missionary activities there. 10 monks and priests in 1793 landed in the Aleutians, but within 2 years, there was only one of them left. All of the other 9 had died, but the one that was left, whose name was Herman, ended up living on Spruce Island, which is next to Kodiak Island, and he really did advocate for positive relationships and defended the rights of the native Alaskan peoples, and he became known as Saint Herman of Alaska. There was also a bishop that came a number of years later in 1825. At first he was a priest. He was Father Veniaminoff. Father Veniaminoff later on was made bishop, and he too was very active during a smallpox epidemic. He really made an extraordinary effort to try to care for those Native Americans who were victims of smallpox, to inoculate them because they did have a smallpox vaccine at that point, and so he became known as Bishop Innocent of Alaska. So for the most part, the Russian Orthodox Church had a very positive relationship and a very positive impact on the Native Americans that were living there. One of the largest of the cities at that point was Unalaska, on the island of Unalaska, which you can see right there. And it had a fairly large-sized church, a customs house. Many of the sort of settlements ended up being just 1 or 2 buildings, and people would trade and go in and out, but they didn't have a lot of permanent residents. But slowly they began to develop a more permanent establishment of residences on northern part of Kodiak Island, on Unalaska, and other places. There really were no British or French influences, British or American influences here until the 19th century. In the 19th century, we began to have, once they became aware of what the opportunities were for fur there, then we started getting more British and Americans showing up, and that led to other kinds of problems. Now, while for the most part the relationship with the Aleuts were positive, there were some areas that they were not. In fact, in some areas, Russian businesses set up fur trading and trapping and hunting, and they, rather than do the work themselves, they hired the Aleuts to provide the actual work, which was fine. Actually, it created a livelihood for some Aleuts, but eventually it began to sort of decay their culture. They began to lose their trading culture, where they had historically had fairs that they would trade different groups of them that had access to different resources, some closer to the water, some further away. And all of that began to sort of fall apart because they began to depend upon the receiving wages or trade goods for the furs that they produced. And being able to, getting trade goods, they lost a lot of their trading systems and things of that sort. In particular, in one area, the Aleuts, as the sea otter population, the fur seal population went down, it made it more and more difficult, and the Russians in one area began to press harder and harder for the Aleuts to produce more and more fur seals, more furs, and even though it became very difficult for them to do so. And they did not, the Russians reduced the goods that they were providing as seals were more rare and it was more difficult to get the furs. Well, finally the Aleuts said, look, this is no longer giving us enough to live on, and so we need to renegotiate this. Well, unfortunately, in one area, a Russian leader named Nezamov responded to this appeal to renegotiate their deal by having 2 of his cronies kill the chief's daughter, the Aleut chief's daughter, who happened to have been Nezamov's mistress. He had her killed in order to make an example of the fact he didn't think she had done enough to try to convince her father, the chief of this particular village, to accept what they were being given by the Russians. And when the Aleuts then tried to respond, the Russians, who had firearms and the Aleuts did not, on 2 occasions they drove them off with firearms, and then eventually, once all of the men had been chased out of the village, the Russians kidnapped 40 women and forced the men to return, and when they did, they executed 4 of the Aleutian men leaders in order to bring them under control. So it wasn't always sweetness and light. Fortunately, later on, the Aleuts reported to the Russian authorities what all had been going on, and Nezamov ended up in jail for a very, very long time because of all that he had done. For the most part, though, it worked out pretty well. Even though the relationships were pretty good in most places, the Aleuts still suffered greatly, primarily because of the introduction of diseases, what has always happened when native tribal peoples anywhere meet Western Europeans, or in this case, Europeans, Russian Europeans. The disease, harsh treatment in some cases, the disruption of their social systems, so that in the absence of Russian support, they were no longer able to care for themselves, meant that whereas there were estimated 25,000 Aleut natives in 1741, by 1910, there were only 1,491. So their population went down by more than 90%. They began to recover by 2000. The census showed that there were 11,941 who claimed to be of pure Aleut descent. So they came up from 1,491 to 11,941, and 7,000 more who claimed to be partial Aleut. Some of that, of the 11,000 who claimed pure Aleut blood, may be a mixture anyway, because there was a lot of intermarrying between Russians and Aleut. But they have made a significant comeback since the times where they were really decimated by disease, etc. So from 1741, during the exploration time, Russia claimed the northwestern area as being Russian America. The capital was in what is now the city of Sitka, Alaska. At that time was called Novo Archangelsk, or New Archangel. And New Archangel was the capital, and Sitka is, if you don't know, down here. So that was the capital. But all of this was the property of Russia. In fact, Russia claimed to control all of the Pacific coast of North America, all the way down, well, they said all of the coast, but they actually actively mapped it down as far as central California. So not only the coast of all of Alaska, but also the coastline down through the current states of Washington, Oregon, and half of California. In fact, at one point, they also controlled part of Hawaii. They had a Fort Elizabeth in Hawaii and a Fort Ross in California. So the Russians at one point claimed an enormous amount of the Pacific properties that are now part of the United States. This man is Alexander Andreevich Baranov. He became known as the Lord of Alaska. He was actually hired by Russian corporations to manage the fur trade for the Russian American Company, the RAC. It's very much like the British East India Company, or the Dutch East India Company, or the Hudson Bay Company. It was privately owned, but government sponsored. The Tsar Alexander, during this time of Russia, had given his blessing to this effort and encouraged it. The only thing that he insisted on is that he wanted these new properties in North America to really expand in terms of towns and cities as a colony. He wanted to be colonized in a serious way. That was his only real requirement, and unfortunately that never really happened. The Russians who moved to this part of the world under Baranov and others, they stuck to the coast, where the primary thing that was making them money, which were fur seals and whales and things of that sort, that's where they were located. And so the Russians, for the most part, never did really move inland. They shunned the inland areas and stayed right on the coast. But Baranov, as the Lord of Alaska, became manager of all of Russia's fur trading activities in Alaska. He created a city on the northern side of Kodiak Island, which became the city of Kodiak. He also built a city called Mikhailovsk in near Sitka, where Sitka is today. And apparently he was very fair to the natives. He purchased the land from Tlingits, the Tlingits, to be able to build this city, and seemed to be very fair in his interactions with them, as opposed to some of the private traders that had come before him. And he began in 1790, by the way, the end of the 18th century. But in 1800, after having built this new city near current-day Sitka, He was back visiting Russia, and a separate Tlingit settlement attacked the city that he had built near current-day Sitka and destroyed it and killed quite a few people. Well, when Baranov came back, despite the fact he was known as being pretty fair-handed, he responded to this by having a Russian naval ship take him there, and they completely destroyed the Tlingit village of the ones that had attacked and burned the city. So he then came back after taking, I guess, revenge or justice, whatever you would want to call it, against the people that had destroyed the city he built earlier, and they rebuilt it on the site of current-day Sitka, and that became the capital city for Russian American, and then later the city of Sitka. So Baranov was really the one most responsible for developing Russian America in terms of an economic endeavor. The New Archangel, which was the city that was rebuilt after they destroyed the first city that Baranov had built, and this is an image of the bay there, a painted image of what that would have looked like. Over a period of time, however, the Americans and the British began to discover what the potentials were in terms of whaling and fur hunting in the Northwest, and more American trading ships started showing up. Trading ships, also fur ships, etc. So the Russian-American company began to be very concerned about that, and they especially were concerned when they discovered, because they had some problems with some of the native groups, mostly it was fine, but there were some problems, they discovered that the Americans were selling guns, firearms to the Native Americans. We Americans tend to do that a lot. And so they were selling weapons to the Native Americans, and the Russians, since they'd had some conflicts, were not too clear on that. And it was at that point the Russians started insisting more adamantly that they owned the entire Pacific coast, as well as parts of Hawaii. And so this led to some real concerns. Fortunately for the Americans, the Russians had not really planned very well in terms of how they were going to resupply the settlement that they had in Russian America. In fact, they were only getting a supply ship about every 2 to 3 years. It simply was not enough to support the activities that were going on. Baranov was in charge of this. No matter what he did, he could not get them to really provide the supplies. Whereas they were delivering the equivalent of 15 million pounds sterling worth of furs to Russia every year, they were getting less than 3 million in supplies that they needed, and only coming every 2 to 3 years. In fact, it's said that the Russian-American office in St. Petersburg was spending more on their office than they were willing to spend on all of Russian America. So they really weren't getting the support they needed. John Jacob Astor, who was a trader, fur merchant, in 1810, he saw an opportunity. So he took a ship, a supply ship, up to New Archangel, the capital city, and offered to sell these needed supplies. It was food, equipment, various other things. Baranov immediately said yes. Now this was even though they were already having concerns about Americans coming to the Northwest and perhaps taking over some of the fur trade and whatnot. But Baranov knew that he had a responsibility to try to take care of the Russian-American needs. So he accepted the purchase and purchased the goods from Astor and promised that he would give John Jacob Astor's company a monopoly to provide the goods that were needed in Russia and Alaska. In return for, he could hire Astor's ship to take furs to Guangzhou in China. Russia and China were not getting along. Russia was not allowed to trade in China, but there was a huge market there. The Americans did have permission to trade in China. So this ended up being sort of a win-win all the way around, because Baranov and the Russians got the supplies they needed, and they were able to make more money by selling furs in China. John Jacob Astor made profits on the sale of the goods that he had, plus he got a cut of the market of furs to China. Everybody seemed happy. And then the War of 1812 came along, and everything sort of caved in, and Astor had to withdraw his involvement. And so in Russia, they continued to struggle with supply. And this was one of the factors that for a long time before it actually happened caused the Russians to think that maybe we really can't support this effort because it's a huge land area. This gives you some idea in terms of Alaska, and you can see the Hawaiian Islands down here also. And then all of the coastline down almost to mid-California was, in generalities, they would say, the Russians would say, we own the whole Pacific coast. But in terms of practical, they had like Fort Ross in California was down at the southern tip of this area, and so they really did claim that that was all part of Russia. But in the 1830s, they recognized that there was a lot more potential there. They couldn't really support it the way they wanted, so the Russian-American companies started leasing part of their territory for hunting, for seal hunting and whale hunting, to the Hudson Bay Company. Hudson Bay Company, of course, had been primarily in the northeastern part of the United States. It's a British company, and they had been primarily involved in the fur trade up around the northeastern part of Canada. Now they came over, they leased land from the Russian-American Company, and the Russian-American Company, again, struggled to try to get enough supplies. The Hudson Bay Company helped provide some of that. Some other Americans were providing that. But finally, in 1824, in order to try to get a little more cash flow out of this, the Russians signed a treaty with America that the Russians would have rights to all trading and hunting and fur activities and things above 54 degrees and 40 minutes north, the parallel. You've ever heard of 54-40 and fight? Later on, James K. Polk, when he was running for president, used that line as a slogan in running for president, because that's the line that was drawn. The Russians said, we have a right north of that. The Americans, and they also signed an agreement with the British that the British had a right below 54-40. And so when James K. Polk came along, it had become a conflict south of that line as to what right the British had, because they had a claim to Canada, and what right the Americans had. And so James K. Polk sort of captured the imagination. He was thought to have no chance against Henry Clay in the presidential election, but he came up with these sort of jingoistic slogans like 54-40 or fight, and ended up in a surprising victory and became president. The British then sort of backed off rather than go to war about this. There were some other conflicts, the Battle of the Pig and some other things having to do with the rights of British Canada versus Americans in that part of the world. But eventually an agreement was set, and it seemed to calm down. But about that time, Baranov retired, and the Russian-American Company decided that only Russian naval officers could be in charge of their activities in Russia-America anymore. Russian naval officers didn't know anything about business. And so they pretty much drove it into the ground at that point. It was poorly run as a business, even though I'm sure they had military discipline. And things began to go downhill for the Russians. And again, the people back in St. Petersburg, back in Russia, are looking at this saying, at what point is this no longer going to be worth it? Because they had lost, the Russians lost a war against the Ottoman Empire and the British, and ended up having to pay reparations for that, the Crimean War. And so they began to be very concerned about all of these things. At the same time, the Orthodox Church in Alaska was continuing to grow. The Russians had translated the liturgies and the texts into Aleut. They were training local clergy and missionaries. They were training natives in general, the native tribes, to read and write Russian. So they were really investing a lot through the Orthodox Church to try to support the local peoples. The missionaries, the Russian Orthodox missionaries, were very much against the exploitation of the Native Americans. As I said before, they provided vaccine during times of epidemic. They really seemed to value the local cultures, and what developed was a kind of a hybrid Native American culture in this area that incorporated the Russian Orthodox belief. And there was much more regard for the local culture than, I'm sad to say, the Protestant churches, who later came there as missionaries, were much more adamant that the Native Americans in Alaska had to become more like them, rather than accepting their culture and introducing Christianity into it. And so eventually there were nearly 90 Orthodox parishes throughout the Russian-American territory, with 20,000 indigenous members during this colonial period of the Russian Orthodox Church. So it was a considerable success. The Tlingit people, interestingly, were never very keen on Russian Orthodoxy, but the Aleuts and some of the other tribal peoples were very much in tune with that. By the 1850s, the previously 300,000 sea otter population, that were primarily the source of the furs, were almost extinct. They had almost destroyed all of them. And Russia needed money, again, to pay Britain back after being defeated in the Crimean War, which was Russia against Britain and the Ottoman Empire, etc. During that period of time, the Russians also had a concern that if the British came and tried to take Alaska away from them, that they did not have sufficient strength in that part of the world to be able to deny that. And so they started thinking, maybe we can sell this place before somebody takes it away from us. And since we can't properly support it anyway, there had been a Canadian gold rush in other places, and the Russians also considered that if they find gold, which some people had thought they ought to be able to in this Alaska, which of course later we did, that they would be so overrun by Canadians and Americans trying to get gold that they wouldn't be able to handle that anyway. And so they started to add up all of these different reasons why they really were not equipped to maintain this settlement in Russian America. And so they started to consider what they could do to get rid of this. In fact, one of the princes, the younger brother to the Tsar, Alexander, he wrote a document which became quite famous in Russia, in which he said, better that we give this away than we have it taken away from us. And he gave all the reasons why, and he had a lot of people agreeing with him about that it would be a huge loss of face and a huge problem if they got to the point where they had a conflict of Britain or somebody else wanting to take Russian America. So in 1861, Russia also agreed to a number of different emancipation reforms in which they owed money to landowners. So they not only did they owe money to the British, they now owed money to Russian landowners because of these emancipation reforms. So they turned to the bankers of Europe, the Rothschilds, and they borrowed the equivalent of 15 million pounds sterling from the Rothschilds at 5% interest a year. Well, when they got to the point they were supposed to start paying that back, they didn't have the money to pay it back. And so again, they're saying, how can we get some money out of this? The Americans at that point, the Russians went to the Americans and they went to the British, hoping they could get a price war going to sell this area. The British had no interest at all in buying this. I think they believed that at some point if they wanted it, they would just take it. And the Americans, sort of on a lark, one of the senators, American senators, said, well, how about $5 million for the whole thing? And the Russians said, no, that's not going to work. That's not sufficient. Well, this was in 1859, and of course, the United States was in the turmoil that eventually would lead to the breaking out of the Civil War. And so everything kind of died in terms of discussions about purchasing this property for then until after the Civil War. But after the Civil War was over, they began the discussion again about possibly purchasing all of this area of Alaska, and they began negotiations with Russia. Russia was desperate to try to get shed of the responsibilities of Russian America. And so on March 30th of 1867 at 4 a.m. in the morning, and that sometimes caused some PR problems for the U.S. government because people said they signed this agreement in the middle of the night because they wanted it to be secret. Basically, they just negotiated all night until they finally came to an agreement when everybody was too tired to argue about it anymore. And they signed the treaty on March 30th of 1867 that the United States purchased all of Russian Alaska for a total of $7.2 million. This was then signed by President Andrew Johnson, and in doing so, they added 584,412 square miles to the United States. That's more than 1.5 million square kilometers at a cost of about 2 cents per acre. Now, there was a lot of difference of agreement at that point as to whether or not this was a good idea. Most people in the United States apparently supported it, even though that's not the common belief today. Most Americans felt like eventually Asia was going to be a major market for the United States and that Russia would be sort of a point of operations for Asian relations. They believed that even though a lot of the fur seals had been killed off, there was still potential there for whaling and for fur trapping and that sort of thing. some people, particularly Horace Greeley with the New York Tribune, one of the most popular newspapers, said he really took exception to all this. He referred to it by various nicknames. He was the first one to call it Seward's Folly, because William Seward was the Secretary of State that signed the treaty on behalf of the United States. So he called it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. At one point it was called a polar bear garden. The New York World referred to the whole thing as a sucked orange, saying that the whole of Alaska, the only benefit that it would give is from fur, and almost all of that was already taken out. So it was a sucked orange. The juice had already been taken out. And they said, interestingly enough, that this should not be accepted even as a gift unless gold were to be found there, which it was in 1896. So we're looking at less than 30 years later. They did discover gold there. At the point at which the Russian America got sold, most Russians ended up, either immediately or very soon after that, returning to Russia. The Russian American company actually provided ships that would allow anyone who wanted to return to Russia. And so by 1873, almost all of the Russians, the citizens of Russia, had left. The population of Sitka, that had been the capital, New Archangel, dropped from 2,500 to just a few hundred in 4 years. And it began to look as though there were not going to be a whole lot left to it. But, of course, not too long after that, they did begin to start making money, still on the seal trade. There was less activity going on, so the fur seals began to recover some. Whaling began to be very active in the Pacific waters off of this. And slowly they began to see a turnaround on it. Part of it is that the processing of the animal products that they brought out of there itself was worth millions of dollars every year after a bit. And so they began to see an advantage. Since then, of course, in 1896, they discovered gold. And we'll talk this afternoon about the Klondike gold rush and a little bit about the Alaskan gold rush as well, which came after that. Not as big, but still they found gold. And then oil as well, and of course we have the oil pipeline. It's interesting that in recent times, and when I say recent times, I mean in the last decade, there have been several economists who have gone back and looked at Alaska, the amount of money that the U.S. federal government has spent in infrastructure there, in the transportation of goods, and providing the governmental structure, because at first Alaska was a department and then a territory. It became a state in 1959. It was the 49th state, Alaska being the last one after that. But some economists have looked at it and said, we've lost money on Alaska since we bought it. And you go, how is that possible? Gold, oil, everything else. And they go, when you've got an area that's almost half the size of the lower 48, twice as big as Texas or whatever, then the amount of money that's been spent trying to maintain that and develop it has been more than we've gotten out of it. But most people, most other economists argue against the several that have made that statement, that that's not the right way to add it up. You have to look at a year-by-year kind of net analysis of that, in which case Alaska has ended up being very, very profitable for the United States. So this is the story of how Russian Alaska came from being the property of Russia to the property of the United States. Any questions about any of that? Paul? Right, 1867.
The same year as the Canadian independence, correct? What's the correlation there, if you're aware of?
So that's the same year as Canadian independence. Is that correct, Canadians? Okay. I'm not aware that there was any direct correlation between the two. I think they were two very different. I mean, one of them had to do with Russia and the United States negotiating over this property. Russia trying to get rid of it as soon as they could, and the U.S. not being prepared to buy it until after the Civil War, and things had settled from that. And then Canada is negotiating in the other direction with Great Britain in order to gain their independence. I'm not aware of a connection unless you are.
I'm not.
Yeah. I think that may have just been a happenstance of history, that there's not any particular connection, at least none that I've read. Any other questions? Yes?
Can you comment on the impact on the marine mammal population? Because I understand that in the late 1700s, one large mammal, I can't remember if it's a walrus or a sea lion, went extinct
Right. So the effect on the marine mammal population, definitely it's less than it was before they started actively. As I say, the 300,000 estimated fur seals that existed there was almost extinct. Interestingly enough, later on, the Russians even instituted some ecological limits on as much as they could control that. And so I know there's been a recovery of much of that. I don't doubt that there are some subspecies that have gone extinct as well. Whaling had a terrible effect. To decimate means to take 1/10, so that's the wrong word. Most of us don't use that word correctly, and I'm using it wrong. But that it really damaged the whale population. Much of that has recovered because of international restrictions on whaling. Japan was a major whaling force, and they're one of the first ones to have now reneged on the original whaling agreements and are being more aggressive in that now. But I think many of those have recovered. I don't know for a fact, but I don't doubt that there's some that have gone extinct. Paul or anybody else, do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think the sea otter was almost totally eliminated.
Exactly. The sea otter was almost extinct. In fact, when I say fur seals, the sea otters I'm sort of including in that because the sea otter was a fur. They were
a fantastic fur in there.
Yeah, and in fact, it was sea otter furs that the Chirikov and Bering's men took back to Russia, which so excited them, and then why so many of them immediately started trying to move into that area. Any other questions? Yes?
How did Russia actually supply the Alaskan area of eastern Russia?
Right.
Not by ship or across land?
Well, how did they actually supply it? There was no land bridge at this point. Again, the Bering Strait land bridge existed 20,000 years ago. By this time, ship was the only way to get there. So yes, they were supplying it by ship, but they were doing a very poor job of it. Again, they were only sending supply ships about every 2 to 3 years. And Baranov, when he was in charge of the operations of Russia and Alaska, he recognized they couldn't, at one point when he was buying food from the Americans, he wrote back and said, if I hadn't done this, I would have had, people starving. It was that bad. And so there was a concern, and sort of looking at it historically, the very fact that the Russians did not do a good job providing the support and supply that was needed in Russian America is a major factor in why the Russians decided that they wanted to sell it and why the Americans ended up owning it, because we were close enough that we could supply that either by sea or by land, whereas the Russians had to do it by sea, and they really didn't seem to be that concerned about it, even the ones that were making a lot of money off the fur industry.
Even eastern Russia suffered in the process too.
Well,
Supply.
Eastern Russia, they did have rail connections and things like that. So they had ways to support themselves in terms of being land connected. It's only when you start talking about having to load up boats and ship stuff across to Russian Alaska, that's where they were really falling down. Siberia, which is what we're talking about northern and eastern Russia, has always been a very difficult place. That's always been a very inhospitable part of the world to live in, and so I'm sure they had some problems as well. But for the most part, Russia took responsibility for that as part of Russia, whereas many of them never did really see Russian America as being Russia. It was this faraway place that they were making money off of, but they didn't want to spend any more on it than they had to, and that's why it ended up being America later. So thank you all very much. We have one more lecture this afternoon. We'll talk about the Klondike Gold Rush. Have a good last day at sea.